And welcome to this episode of the Good Citizen Podcast. My honor to have on as a return guest, Tim Goeglein, all the way from Washington, D.C., actually just across the street from the U.S. Supreme Court. Tim, how are you doing today?
It's great to be with you again, Josh. Truly always a pleasure.
Well, I'm encouraged by the new book that you have just put out entitled What Really Matters, Restoring a Legacy of Faith, Family, and Freedom. We've been doing a number of interviews this year just commemorating America's 250th anniversary. In fact, people may be a little tired. I don't know. There's a lot to celebrate. But when I think of your work, your legacy of faith and impact in Washington, D.C., I definitely wanted to capture that in this really important year in our history. And so you've compiled a number of your articles. So we're going to cover a number of different themes, but the idea is how can we recover, how can we renew the United States, faith, family, and freedom. So looking forward to jumping into that. But first, I wanted to ask just perhaps maybe the mood in Washington, D.C. With the attempted assassination on the president over the weekend at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. So I don't know if maybe there's any feel or activity around the city, but would just be interested in that.
Well, I appreciate you asking. Let me say two things, if I may, Josh. The first is that, in our 250 years as the beloved United States of America, we have had less than 50 presidents. And you can do the percentages. We have had four presidents assassinated. And if you wrap into that percentage or mix the assassination attempts, much less the multiple assassination attempts, that number is astronomically high. And it correlates with freedom. The freer the society, the larger the society. We're a complex continental nation of 340 million souls. Somebody gets on a train in California, goes to Chicago, comes to Washington, comes into Union Station, goes a few blocks, and the next thing you know, he's a guest at a hotel and tries to ram through the magnetometers with the president, the Speaker of the House, cabinet members, the vice president. I mean, it's all very sobering. And as Christians, it's not an over or an understatement to say that four assassination attempts on, President Trump's life, in under, 2 years, and you come to the conclusion that divine shielding and divine protection is absolutely as real as the fact that we're having this conversation. The political class, and rightfully so, whether the person in the Oval Office is a Democrat or a Republican, automatically asks all the questions, the perimeter, and where is the most secure place, and all those sorts of questions. The fact of the matter is that it's important to maximize security. It's also important to recognize that there is a spiritual quotient in all of this. And if we miss the spiritual quotient in all of this, I think, Josh, we miss it. And it's why I wrote the book, What Really Matters, my fifth book, because I think the political class spends a lot of time talking about border security and taxes and wars, and they should, that's their duty. But they ought to spend more time, in my humble opinion, talking about the things that really matter: faith, family, freedom, parental rights, marriage, the future of children in our country, religious liberty, and conscience rights. I think it's very important that the political class on both sides of the aisle realize that things of the spirit are really important.
I just think back to the Pennsylvania attempt and just the turn of his head, and you definitely can sense, providence at work. And we never assume these things, but we can notice them, and we see them there. And as we pray for our president, as we pray for all of our governing officials, we are grateful for his protection. And it is concerning the level of rhetoric, violence. Now, I mean, the American Republic, as you've mentioned, has always been a bit, rowdy, is kind of the way I've framed it before. But certainly the rise in political violence we see, up and down the states, up to the federal level. I'm thinking of some of the state representatives that were killed in Minnesota. It definitely is concerning, and I think it does argue for us to be leading when it comes to civil discourse, We disagree with folks on policy and sometimes the way things are stated, but we should certainly go first. So thank you for just helping us understand kind of what the mood is in DC. As we jump in, if you haven't heard of Tim before, and I'm grateful to have had Tim on the podcast a number of times, I always appreciate his story and his wisdom, but he is the Vice President of External and Government Relations for Focus on the Family. He formerly served as a special assistant to President George W. Bush and is a deputy director of the White House Office of Public Liaison. He was the president's principal outreach contact for conservative and faith-based groups. He has an extensive resume. It includes the Heritage Foundation, communications director for U.S. Senator Dan Coates. That's our connection there to Indiana, and Gary Bauer. He's also authored a number of books I'd certainly recommend to you. The Man in the Middle, Faith and Politics in the George W. Bush Era. Also American Restoration. And previously we talked about Stumbling Towards Utopia. Very insightful as well, kind of tracking where we are back into the 60s. But wanted to start today, just what is maybe a recent story? As you're traveling the United States, maybe an encouraging story that you witnessed this year as you're thinking about renewal, something that's been an encouragement to you.
Well, I've had several, and as you may know, Josh, and thank you for that very warm introduction. In the academic year, as one of the vice presidents at Focus on the Family, I'm on a different college campus almost every week or every other week. Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Azusa Pacific, the Concordias, Liberty, Hillsdale, the gamut. And I was at a very well-known Ivy League school just a couple of weekends ago. You travel into the Ivy League and you have our worldview. It's not always commodious. And I met a young man of all things named Ezekiel. And during one of the debates there, when a young woman was articulating, why our worldview is old-fashioned, passé, and not relevant, up stands Ezekiel, magnanimous, graceful, civil, and he said to his classmate, a lot of us have been acculturated. He didn't use the word acculturated. He said a lot of us have been sort of trained, to keep silent. That we know that we can be socially or professionally punished if we speak out. But he said, there's a lot of people here this afternoon who agree with Focus on the Family. And I was really astonished, Josh, in a great way, to have a forest of hands of young people go up and people clapping and applauding, not for me, but for the Focus on the Family worldview. And that's what I get to and what really matters. In Stumbling Toward Utopia, my fourth book, which you mentioned a moment ago, I wanted to do an analysis of where the moral and social revolution of the 60s and the 70s came from. In this book, What Really Matters, I try to measure the impact of that tsunami in our country and culture, specifically its impact on marriage, family, parenting, parental rights, religious liberty, and what we can actually do about it. And I think that there are very substantial numbers of young men and women in the rising generation. They may not be in the majority. I'll think of them as a remnant, but they're out there, and and every one of them are a silver lining. They want something better, and I think that that's good news for everybody.
That's so encouraging, and just to hear that from the next generation, even in the environment that you've mentioned, you think that would not happen in those spaces,
Right.
but I'm grateful for the courage that I'm seeing in the next generation and willing to stand up and say, hey, this isn't working. Let's follow a different way.
Yeah,
So,
and you'll forgive me for 1 second. I just want to pick up on the very last thing that you said, because we have the lowest marriage and fertility rates in all of American history. In fact, in 2025, for the first time that I'm aware of, more babies in America were born to women in their 30s than in their 20s. I mean, that's really counterintuitive. And what I found in researching what became this book, I found that fewer than half of U.S. households are married couples. That's very changing in the United States. It's a very significant shift from not 1,000 years ago, but just 50 years ago, Josh, when nearly two-thirds of all American households were comprised of a married husband and wife. So I think that's the kind of sobering news over against the good and hopeful news of young people who want something better and different.
And I always try to be a hopeful realist, and I appreciate you helping us
Yes.
with that, Tim. And that we are facing, stark issues, stark challenges, even as we're here in the state of Indiana, and even as we look around the country, trying to work on things like foster care, and you see addiction. So many of those crises come back to that breakdown of the family, where we've rejected God's ideas around family formation, and
Yes.
now we wonder why we're facing such dysfunction and brokenness. So I think it is time to get back to those first principles. So one thing I appreciate about you, Tim, is that you have been in this space for a long time, and like in church leadership, in kind of public leadership, people come and go often. And so to have someone with the perspective that you have, you've been working in this space for a long time. The book is largely a compilation of various articles pulled into themes. What was the reason, or kind of what moved you to put that together into a book right now?
Yes, I'm a regular contributor to the Federalist, to the Daily Signal, the Daily Citizen, the Washington Times, and the Epoch Times. And when I was on another college campus, Josh, just a couple of years ago, thinking about this book, after I finished my remarks in the Q&A, undergraduates sometime want to continue the conversation, and we were doing that. And a young woman said, Mr. Goeglein, I think I agree with most of what you've said, which, of course, to a speaker, you always want to hear. But then she said, I wonder why, she kind of mused out loud, I wonder why the political class does not spend more time speaking about and advocating what really matter. And I thought, wow, I think that'd make a great title because it's true.
There it is, yeah.
And it was really the thing that we're searching for. So I wanted to write a book of a compilation that really is under five or six, what I think of as kind of ideas: restoring marriage, restoring the family, etc. But the one area that I most wanted to write about and devote an entire chapter to is called restoring the American male, because what I found in this demographic, 18 to 30 years old, among American men, I think is the most hopeful and also at the same time the most sobering demographic in all of the United States. Sobering because men account for three out of every four suicides and drug overdoses. And here's what I'm really struck by: about 15% of American men, Josh, say they have no friends. I mean, this is not just a, kind of a loneliness crisis or an isolation crisis, which is what people have suggested. I think it is that, but I think it's much deeper than that. I think we are talking here about a spiritual crisis of the first ranks. And increasingly, it's not always or even mostly always related to affluence or education. And the need to restore the American male, I think, has never been more important in the American experience than now. Here's the hopeful news: the same demographic of men, 18 to 25, they say they want to be married, they want to have children, they're going back to church and having what you and I would say is kind of a faith or spiritual seeking of a community and regular fellowship. I think that's all to the good. I mean, I think that that's very important. I think most people would. What is concerning is that the same demographic of young women, aspirationally, they say they would like to be married. They say they'd like to have children. But the problem, Josh, as you well know, is we have millions of young American men, able bodied young American men, let's say 18 to 30. They're not in school, they're not applying to be in school. They are not working. They're not seeking a job. And the question is, are they marriageable? And I think for large numbers of American women, the answer is no, because progressive and conservative women, both, I mean, red and blue, when they are asked, what are you looking for in a husband? They will say economic stability and continuity. If they want to have children, somebody who will make an excellent father and can help provide or be the sole provider. I mean, I think this is an area in our country, culture, and civilization, the restoration of the American male, where we deserve and need to spend more time.
It is a sobering thought, and the challenge of how do you do this well. We had on Delano Squires from the Heritage Foundation recently, and he's talking about this specifically in the Black family, and of course that is a creation order concept as well. So what he's doing
Yes.
there, mentorship, strong faith communities, having the benefit of the local church where you have multi-generational socioeconomic groups that can help provide that support. So been thinking about this a lot. I know a number of church leaders are also thinking about this, and we need to do so as we look towards the future. Again, you have the benefit of some time, and you, especially in stumbling towards utopia, we're talking about these cultural changes, and in the book you're talking about these cultural drips, these ideas that maybe at first, if you just get off course a little bit, that's not too damaging. But what would you say is perhaps the most significant cultural drip or idea that's causing so much havoc?
Yeah, I think it is organized principally about, and I write about this in What Really Matters, this idea of a matrix of individualism, of a leftover remnant of the sexual revolution, which is sort of men against women, women against men. This recurs over and over again in popular culture. A profound confusion about what a man is and what a woman is. Here in Washington, where I have lived and worked for nearly 40 years, we had a nomination process for a sitting United States Supreme Court justice. And Josh, she was told before the hearing ever began that she was going to be asked the following question: what is a woman? Her husband, who is a medical doctor, was sitting right behind her at the nomination hearing. Now, clearly, now Justice Jackson knows what a woman is. But in culture, it's important to unpack and say, why was she unable to tell the truth? We would think that the number one requisite of a Supreme Court justice is truth telling as a reflection of character. And I think we have seen over and over again these very malicious seeds that have been planted. And when they germinate, it's extremely uneven. And you have a rising generation of young Americans who, since the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, early 2000s, they've had to come up in the soil of this very difficult matrix of issues. And so, what you end up with, for instance, is that the suicide and so-called self-harm rates for adolescents, and may I say particularly for girls, has quadrupled. And I'll say this again, it has quadrupled just since 2010, which of course was the start of the smartphone era. So I think that when you have 60% of girls and 30% of boys reporting persistent feelings of loneliness, we ought to take them at their word. And we ought to say that as a country, culture, and civilization, and especially as the church, we have to address this straight up.
And church leaders have been, I think, from the beginning, those in the Christian spaces, mentioning smartphones, mentioning this new technology. It's going to have an impact. And when you marry that to confusion over creation order, what it means to be male and female, we've created just this maelstrom, and it's playing out right there in the social science. Church leaders, I think we're seeing it at the local level, but now to have that hard social data, it's time to do something with it. So I appreciate you mentioning that. I wanted to ask you about the concept of Christian patriotism. And it seems like anyone that steps up and says, hey, I love the United States, I'm a follower of Jesus, they just get branded with this term of Christian nationalism. And I'm sure no one has ever used that moniker for you. so, uh, but that, I think, has also led Christians to be almost a little shy or concerned about expressing any sort of patriotism. And so, how can Christians have a confidence about their love of country? How is that appropriate? How can that be appropriately expressed, especially as we celebrate 250 years?
You know, everybody has their favorite source where they repair to say, how should I really think about this kind of unfair criticism? And my own, Josh, is Chuck Colson's book. The late great Chuck Colson is a great friend, and I've written about our friendship. He wrote a very terrific book that I commend to everybody called Kingdoms in Conflict. And there was a kind of a redraft of that book called God and Government. And it's a take on St. Augustine's City of God and City of Man. That in the way that Christians see the world, God created government, He created the church, He created the family. And these three great institutions do overlap, but they are distinct institutions with distinct roles. The family is not the church is not government, government's not the family, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think it is overwhelmingly probable that men and women of faith completely understand that a pastor is not a president and a president is not a pastor, and you can be fully patriotic and be a Christian in good standing. There is not a conflict here. The problem is the one where anybody of either political party, of any et cetera, would somehow conflate that the church is government, or the church is a political party, or a political party in government, is the church. But I have found overwhelmingly that is distinctly not the case in the United States. People understand the absolute difference between the two. Of course they do. And I think Chuck Colson was right when he says these are kingdoms in conflict. When you live and work in Washington, when you live and work in Indianapolis or Sacramento, the nation's capital or the state capitals, you find that you are, as a Christian, in the public square and you're in the private sphere. And when you step into the public square, the kind of prudential view that distinguishes these two realms, the city of God, the city of man, it's important to make those distinctions. What I think is much more important, Josh, and much more timely, is the fact that we should all be deeply concerned about what I think of as cultural and historical illiteracy among all Americans, regardless of faith, regarding the American story. I mean, the average U.S. history score at the 8th grade level in the United States of America decreased by 5 points just between 2018 and 2022, and by almost 10 points from 2014. That's a very fancy way of saying only about 13% of 8th graders are deemed proficient in history. I mean, that's completely unacceptable.
I was reflecting on this when President Trump had posted that AI generated image, which appeared to have him as Christ, putting his hand on a sick United States. And the people that I meet, church leaders, committed Christians, they know how to rightly order their loves. So they have Christ first. And so, later on was he a hospital worker? But what I saw from the Christian community when they thought that maybe he was trying to put himself in the place of Jesus, or had posted that, was just routine. Hey, just a reminder that Jesus is king, you're the president. And for
Yes.
me, people can have different takes on what occurred, but to me, that was just further evidence of most Christians that I know how to properly order their loves. They love Jesus first, but then they can love their country. And I think there's just this reticence of, if I express any patriotism, then I'm doing something unbiblical. And so I appreciate that, just helping us, especially as we celebrate 250 years. It's worth learning the American story. It's worth celebrating what God's done. So I appreciate that from you and from others that are celebrating the United States at 250 years. One other topic I wanted to jump into as well is you were working with George W. Bush as a liaison to the faith community. And I've been comparing the moment that we're in to a Joseph moment, in a sense, that we kind of know how to do Moses to Pharaoh when government and the faith community is adversarial. But how do we act? How do we steward the moment when we actually have an opportunity to work alongside government? So I might ask just any encouragement you'd have for our listeners. You've been there. You mentioned these are kingdoms in conflict, but you've been in a White House, and now we have a current White House that is inviting the faith community to engage some of these problems we've talked about. Any advice on how we steward that moment well?
Yeah, I'm very honored to be asked because I spend my professional life as one of the vice presidents at Focus on the Family in the halls of power every single day. In fact, today I've been in the United States Senate and I've been in the United States House and I was briefly at the United States Supreme Court. And I think it's very important that we bring our faith to bear. In the halls of power. I mean, everybody is given a different vocation. Some people wouldn't think, even for one day in their lives, that they want to even be near, the House, the Senate, the Supreme Court, the White House, et cetera. And it's important that we all do our own vocations with excellence. But I think it is more important now than at any time in American history that Christians step into the public square with confidence, with grace, with magnanimity, with civility, but also a willingness to be unapologetic about the things that matter most. And that's why I wrote the book. I am encouraging as strongly as I can for my brothers and sisters in Christ to realize that democracy is not a spectator sport. You and I, Josh, we know people of very goodwill. In fact, excellent people, and they're kind of part of what I think of as the ought to caucus. We ought to do this. We ought whatever, and they mean well. But just because we think it is not how we actually impact the process of culture and public policy. You have to write the screenplays. You have to find a trajectory to be the president of the university or the college. You have to run for public office. You have to be on the school board. You have to be in those places where sometimes you don't particularly have an inclination until you realize that if you yourself don't step up, there might not be anybody else to do it. I spend a lot of my professional life with people, Josh, as you well know, who do not share our worldview. I spend a good amount of time with people who really don't understand conservatism. They don't understand Christianity. I say this unblinkingly and uncritically, but many of them have never read the gospel. They've never been in a church. They really don't know the ideas that we are propounding. So we have to go tell a new generation. And I think that we have to find a way to understand that it's our most important duty in this generation to shape and form and impact the rising generation so that they will carry on the first principles that gave to us this remarkable and beloved country. I was thinking earlier in your reference to our 250th a pending birthday. The Spanish don't know when they were born. The Italians don't know when they were born. The British don't know when they were born, but we know when we were born, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon on July 4th, 1776. We ought to spend a lot of time, as I do in what really matters, saying what kind of a country do we want 50 years from now? I think that's a pretty good question, much less what kind of a country do we want 250 years from now? I think that's what statesmen and stateswomen do.
I just want to strongly recommend the book. As you mentioned, you go through these 5 different areas. If you're looking for thoughtful, biblical wisdom on the issues that are confronting the country, there's just a wealth of knowledge and hundreds, more than 200 footnotes in here, if I remember correctly. And, so a wealth of knowledge, information. But as we conclude today, I was just going to ask, you have a blueprint for how we restore faith, family, freedom. But just for the listener, that church leader, that mom that's raising kids in the next generation,
Yes.
what is maybe just kind of one thing that they could think about as they're doing their part? Maybe it seems like this massive task to renew the United States. If you could have maybe grind it down for us and something they could think about.
I'd love to do that. Two of the men who had the greatest impact on my thinking and my development, both working in the Senate for 10 years for Dan Coates, 8 years at the White House for George W. Bush, and now for the last 18 at Focus on the Family. If I had to pick two men, I would say one was the late, great James Q. Wilson, who was a public intellectual of the first order and thought a lot about the issues that we've been talking about today, Josh. And another was a now deceased senator of the Democratic Party, Pat Moynihan, who I got to know because he crossed over in the U.S. Senate in the time with Dan Coates. I used to joke that he seemed to vote wrong, but he certainly got the analysis right. And Jim Wilson, I hope this will encourage people who are listening to us. That Jim said it's not money, but the family that is the foundation of public life. And he said that as the family has become weaker, every structure upon that foundation has become weaker. And I think that's right. I think that should sober us. And Pat Moynihan, and I think this is uplifting, Pat said that marriage orients men and women toward the future, asking them not just to commit to each other, but to plan, to earn, to save, and to devote themselves to advancing their children's prospects. I think that's absolutely correct, spot on. And how do we do that? It seems to me part of it is sharing with the next generation that marriage is a really good thing, that babies and children are a really good thing, and that orienting your life around a faith community is a very good thing, that friendships and relationships matter, and that in the Christian life, discouragement and despair is a sin because it negates the hope of Jesus Christ. So I think yes, we want to be optimists, but I think we have to be hopefulists. Somebody asked me just yesterday, she said to me, "You seem awfully busy." And I said, "I am. There's a lot to do." And I think that we all have a lot to do in defense of all the things that really matter.
Well, Tim, when I think of a happy warrior that has been in DC for a long period of time and yet still hopeful, still strategic, I definitely think of you. I was also off on the footnotes by, I don't know, a couple hundred. It's 400 and
That's
plus
correct.
footnotes. I know you painfully wrote those, so thank you for your graciousness there. But again, just an amazing resource. The book is What Really Matters: Restoring a Legacy of Faith, Family, and Freedom, with 462 footnotes and a great blueprint for where we go from here. So I want to recommend that to our leaders. And Tim, thank you again for taking the time. Always enjoy the conversation.
Josh, you're so gracious, and I love our friendship and our time together, and I hope people get what really matters and really enjoy it.